Gazprom, according to the contracts that it has for supplies to the Germans, if they shut off the pipeline for any reason, then Gazprom is on the hook to compensate the Germans for replacement supplies at whatever price the Germans have to pay, which was 7 times what Gazprom was earning. So after a couple weeks of that, the Gazprom folks are like looking at their budget like, holy crap, this is bad. So they blew up their own pipeline because then it's force majeure. It's just a theory. I think it holds up for about 15 seconds longer than the other theories, but still it's a reach.
But it gives you at least a theory that holds up a tiny bit longer than the other ones.
The Swedes, behind closed doors, are 100% certain that it was the Russians.
Really?
Yes, and they have been since the day it happened. They had assets in theater, they were listening, they've been down, they've swabbed, they've done all the tests, they've seen all the hardware, and they're maintaining firmly that this was the Russians the whole time. But if the Europeans publicly accuse with proof, then they cannot import anything from Russia any longer, because the Russians would have been blowing up critical European infrastructure. And the whole idea of the sanctions regime is to give the Europeans time to adapt.
Right.
And so cutting it off in a day, no. Now, if we get to a point a year from now when the Russian stuff is gone from the European system, then, the Swedes will probably come out and, here's the proof. We're not there yet.
Why do you say what you
Sure. Well, let's start with the basis that a lithium-based electric vehicle absorbs a huge amount of energy in its creation. And most of the lithium processing, most of the aluminum processing, most of the silicon processing, and that's what's in the frames, is all done in China, and it's all done with soft coal. So the carbon footprint for these things is not being factored into most people's carbon assessments when you're determining where the break-even price is in terms of carbon. If you do that, there are any place in the world that runs on a mix that is more than 70% fossil fuel, which is the vast majority, you're talking at a break-even time that approaches a decade, if not more. And that's for light vehicles. You get into heavies, it extends it out considerably. Now, there aren't a lot of EV heavy vehicles, so take that for what it is. So that's problem number one. Problem number two, if you want to electrify transport in North America, you need to double the size of the grid. That would obviously be a challenge.
Double the size.
Yeah, so what we've done in the last 150 years, double that in the next 7.
Right.
Okay. And you can throw enough money at it to make it happen. It doesn't make them impossible, just makes them perhaps not the best idea. But there is something out there that makes it impossible. If you want to double the size of the grid, if you want to electrify transport, and if you want to do it on a schedule that people say we want to achieve by 2030, that means we need 3 times as much copper, 4 times as much chromium, 4 times as much aluminum, 10 times as much nickel, 18 times as much graphite. Never in human history have we ever doubled our production of any industrial material in a 10-year period, ever. And we're going to do this for 14 materials now.
Simultaneously.
Right. And we're losing Russian output, and the Russians are a top 4 producer for about half of this stuff. And we're going to lose the processing capacity in China. So this cannot happen with today's technology. Just can't. This stuff isn't there. Does that mean we will walk away from it completely? Not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is we're going to have to make choices about where we want to apply these materials and where we can get the biggest bang for our buck. Now, if this was done purely looking at economics and carbon, I would put wind turbines throughout the Great Plains, including in Alberta. I would put solar in the American Southwest, roughly from central Texas and the Austin-San Antonio corridor, all the way to Los Angeles. Yep. And then I would spend most of the money and most of the resources that we have on transmission from those zones to the places that don't. And that would probably gobble up almost all of the material, or like our quote share of global materials. Now, the materials are not available globally. So we're going to be able to do more in the Western Hemisphere than the Eastern, but we also have better wind and solar frontage in the Western Hemisphere than the Eastern. But putting up solar panels, the only place in the world that it's dumber to put solar panels up than Toronto is Berlin. And so these are the 2 capitals that are pushing this the hardest. It's just absolutely asinine. One of the fun things that we're seeing in the green community right now is a conversation which is degrading into a debate, which is degrading into a knife fight between the Greens of California and the Greens of Germany. Because the 2 of them have very similar policies when it comes to encouraging renewables. The Californians have spent 1/3 as much as the Germans and are getting 5 times the power because the sun doesn't shine in Germany.
Yes.
But it does in California. The Greens are going to be the ones at the lead of deciding where this works and where it doesn't. And that is absolutely the community we want making this decision. We're not there yet, but we are rapidly moving in the right direction. EVs don't make the cut. You would have to have a green system to manufacture them, and you would have to power them with green, and it would have to be in a society where everyone can charge their cars at the day, which means they're all working night shift.
Right.
I am unaware of a metro where that exists. So EVs just don't work in a constrained environment. So you focus on generation where generation does well, and then you use transmission to get it to the next tier of cities beyond that zone. That's still a really good start. Well, let's start with the supply issue because it's relevant for nuclear too. The single largest supplier of uranium to the world is Kazakhstan. And most of that stuff is processed in either China or Russia. So we honestly can't, that's like 40% of global supply that is under a degree of threat right there. So while I certainly agree that nuclear should be part of the solution, we do have an absolute limit as to how big it can get, even before you consider the political obstacles.
Saskatchewan does have a lot of uranium too.
That is true, and Canada and Australia are the two countries that are expanding their output most quickly, but it's just the process for bringing uranium on doesn't just involve the mine, and then it's the milling, then it's the yellowcake, and then it's the hexafluoride processing and the spinning down. There's a lot of infrastructure steps before you get to fuel. So a really big investment program right now, you're talking minimum 10 years before you actually get the fuel in volume, and that doesn't count the time it takes to build the reactor. So it's a long-term solution if we're going to do it. And then in the United States, at least, we still don't have a fuel disposition program. We have Yucca Mountain, which is still not operational, which is already completely subscribed. And so everyone's basically leaving them in coolant ponds right on site, which is not, in my opinion, a very viable long-term solution. Now, other countries have come up with ways to make it work better. The technology is there, but it would require multiple acts of Congress to push that forward. And the Soviets, not the Russians, the Soviets were very successful in the 60s in encouraging anti-nuclear sentiment throughout the Western world. Honestly, that's where Greenpeace came from. And a lot of that lingers today. And then, of course, every once in a while, you have a Chernobyl or a Fukushima, and that doesn't help. That are probably about ready for prototype stage. So one of them is called a pebble bed. It's a 4th generation nuclear facility. The French are probably the closest to building it. And the fuel's in pebbles in a bed of insulated material. So even if everyone shuts down all the safety protocols and leaves for the weekend, there's not enough uranium in each individual pellet to go into meltdown. So in theory, it's meltdown proof, in theory. You still have to build it. The second one are small modular reactors that you can fit in a container on the back of a truck. And the idea is you can pull that into a decommissioned coal power plant and just hook it up to the electricity system.
Right.
And all of a sudden, 3/4 of the cost of a normal reactor goes away. And based on the size of the power plant, you can put up to 9 of these into a single arrangement. The United States government just gave approval to the prototype design. And so they're now going to be building one of those over the next couple of years. So hopefully we'll find out within a couple of years whether it's viable and safe. But if it is, you still then have to go through the process of bringing it into mass manufacture.
Right.
And so you're really talking about 2030 before we get any appreciable movement in this in terms of actually affecting you're talking about something that is far more proliferation prone than a conventional reactor. Keep in mind that because it's a military asset and it is by definition sequestered and under guard at all times, they don't use low enriched uranium in the subs. They use weapons grade uranium, and that's how it can be so small. You would not want a Bubba in North Dakota operating that. Sure. Well, let's start with the fact of why people are paying attention for the first time. It's for 75 years, the Americans maintained the globalized system. We told everyone for 75 years, borders don't matter. And, when your entire business life of you and your parents are in that environment, you forget how the rest of the world works because you have been told by the superpower that you don't need to worry about it. For Ukraine, this is a classic Athens, Sparta, David, Goliath fight. So the Ukrainians are massively outnumbered, even with all the equipment they've gotten from NATO. And the Russians are now rousing themselves. They started the war with 100,000 troops in Ukraine, and they are now in the midst of their second mobilization. And by the time we get to May, they will have over 700,000 in theater. The Ukrainians don't have any more men. So just the scale of which, just the size of the challenge the Ukrainians face is huge. The Ukrainians cannot win a war of attrition. And in a battle where they inflict 3-1 casualties on the Russians,
they'll still lose.
they'll still lose. And they'll lose badly because that assumes that the 3 Russians die and the 1 Ukrainian heals and can live to fight another day. It's just not enough. You need to get it up to a minimum of 8-1. 10-1 would be better. The only way you do that is with speed and mobility. Whether it's battle tanks, artillery, deep strike, whatever it happens to be, the Ukrainians have to be able to outmaneuver the Russians, cut off their logistical supplies, and circle them and kill them in mass. That is the only way that Ukraine wins this war. And they had hoped to be able to start that this winter. But this winter is the freakishly warm. It is 30 degrees. Well, sorry, Canada. It is 20 degrees.
Yeah, 15.
Yeah, 20. It's 20 degrees above norm. And so the ground has never frozen in in Ukraine. And instead of being able to run tanks and artillery through the fields that are frozen and hit the Russians wherever they feel they need to, they have been stuck in fixed place defense against human wave assaults. And yes, they're killing Russians by the tens of thousands, but it's not enough and it's not fast enough. And by the time we get to May, when the ground dries out enough that they will be able to do that, there are going to be so many more Russians in theater. And the Russians are probably going to push on at least 3 different axes in order to break Ukraine up and make the movement option impossible. So when we get to May, and the Russians launch these assaults, the more mobile, smaller Ukrainian forces are going to have to choose very carefully where to stand and fight to try to blunt those assaults and where to try to get behind them and break them up. It's not a fair fight. By the numbers, Russia should win. That doesn't mean that they will, because the Russians have been going out of their way to try to fail at every opportunity so far.
And there have been other times in this conflict where, on paper, one would have assumed that the Russians would have won by now.
The Ukrainians are absolutely punching well above their weight, and that's before you consider that by May we will have 60,000 Ukrainian forces who have been training with NATO for the last few months coming in with better equipment. So it really is an Athens-Sparta kind of